Hey everyone, this is Christoph. I'm the founder of Scale Your Code, where developers learn from each other. Chris Fidao is here to talk about what it takes to quickly set up a secure and efficient server. He wrote a book called Servers for Hackers, and the topics we're going to discuss are covered in greater detail in the book, so that way you have a reference. What you'll learn from this interview is how to have a more efficient code deployment, steps to take to secure and automatically configure your servers, and how Nginx and PHP-FPM really work behind the scenes. But before we do that, let me tell you about a website that made this interview possible and that I think you'd like to know more about. This interview is sponsored by LeanPub. LeanPub is the platform for authors and publishers to publish amazing books. They allow authors like Chris to easily publish books for us to learn from. Simply put, LeanPub is the best way in the world to write a book and buy a book and support causes through the LeanPub for Causes program. Help me thank them for allowing me to keep these interviews free, and thank Chris for sharing his knowledge by checking out his book and the library of books they have at leanpub.com. Lean as in muscle lean, pub as in publications.com. Chris, it's good to have you on Scale Your Code.
Hey, how's it going?
So Chris, you sent me an email a few weeks ago, and you said you enjoyed Steve Corona's interview, and that was awesome. But I'm really curious to know if you learned anything from it, since you write a lot about similar topics.
Right, yeah, and actually his book got me started on this path, more so than I was doing. It's a really good resource. The real thing that was most interesting to me in his interview was when he talked about using Nginx over a proxy. Because I know in his book he goes into using a proxy as a load balancer, but it seems like since then he's found some information on benchmarks and that kind of thing, and he's preferred Nginx now in his stack, which makes sense because it's a simpler stack. You don't have this extra technology that you're using. You can just keep everything Nginx.
I love that. I love the fact that even though you're really knowledgeable about these same topics, you still learn something new from Steve's interview. That's exactly what I want to accomplish with Scale Your Code. So tell us, how did you start tinkering around with servers, and why did you go down that path?
The path stuff started just because I kept running into server issues. I used to work in a marketing place, and we'd have a lot of clients. And for the most part, we would make content management systems. Occasionally, we would have a custom application, sometimes under a deadline. And when there's a deadline, like all checks and like extra work, all stuff goes out the window. So like there was one time when it was like 3 a.m. when we were trying to deploy a site. It was using Rackspace Cloud, and they handled setting up like a load balancer and the web nodes behind it and all that stuff. And we only sort of knew how that stuff worked. But then there's surprises when we're trying to deploy the site at that time because we were just under such a crunch. So like something like figuring out that sessions needed to be handled specially behind a load balancer because each server by default would have its own session, and when someone gets bounced to the next server because it's load balanced, they could lose their session data, and like all sorts of related issues. So that kind of stuff got me interested in learning the server stuff because I knew that gap in knowledge was really hurting me. So I started using VMware. This is before Vagrant was out. And I just made servers and I spun them up and I started developing on them. And that forced me to learn all this server stuff. And anytime I learned something new, I just started writing down everything in like a markdown file and saving that. So like every command I ran to figure out some process, like installing Apache or configuring it and Nginx and basically anything I do on it.
Then is it fair to say that the book came along because you had issues and couldn't really find all that information in the same place, and so you thought, well, why not put it into a book?
Yeah, well, the book came eventually because I started the Servers for Hackers newsletter a year ago, probably a little more, and then I just every like 2 weeks. So I've subscribed to a bunch of newsletters, and the format of those is always like, here's a list of 20 links and like a short blurb for each one. And I never clicked on any links. There's just too much stuff in them. So I made a newsletter, and I had this idea of like making 1 or 2 posts per newsletter, so that like each one was like a specific topic, and in each week could like expand on that topic or just do something new. And I like that approach a lot. I think other people have liked it. So it ends up being like a blog, and you end up building up your content. And from that content, I was in a good place to write a book. Um, and the book is a good place to get a little more in depth on topics, and then of course make like a coherent piece that you can refer back to and all that kind of stuff. And of course, making money is fun too. So why not do that?
And that's really what I liked about your book the most. Like you said, it gives more in-depth information on how certain things work, like Nginx, for example, and Apache and PHP-FPM, but you also talk about Apache. So you offer different alternatives instead of just saying, this is exactly how you should do it. Overall, how would you compare your book to Steve Corona's book, Scaling PHP Applications? What's the difference between the two books? Why should someone get his book and your book as well?
Right. Yeah. So I like Steve's book a lot because it's focused on like a path and like kind of specifics. You could almost call that like, if you're talking about a coding framework, it's more like opinionated than general. My book is a little more general. Sort of it gives you a bunch of information, but that information is kind of focused on web development. A lot of stuff for PHP developers, but it's not focused on PHP at all. It has some Python and just general server stuff in it too.
Great, let's dive right in. So what does your development environment stack look like? What tools do you use? Do you use Vagrant, Capistrano?
Yeah. So Vagrant primarily. And there's a few ways to use Vagrant. I use Vagrant. I almost always use Ubuntu's latest stable release. Their LTS releases, which just get pumped out every 3 years, I think, if I remember right, and they're supported for 5 years. So they're kind of a good platform for a relatively stable build that doesn't change too much, versus being on like bleeding edge Ubuntu builds, which change and might change in ways that'll break, which is something you don't really want in a development environment, really. Which is okay in a development environment, I guess, but stable's better. So Vagrant, I typically use Ubuntu, but whatever distribution you use should reflect what you use at work or day to day or whatever. Because if you're in a work environment and you always use CentOS, with Linux and just other stuff enabled, you should probably have that in your dev environment also, just so you don't really have surprises. So that there's a lot of stuff we can go into. So like Vagrant.
Well, let's break it down for people who don't know what Vagrant is or just haven't used it yet. What is Vagrant and what does it do? How is it beneficial to developers?
Yeah, of course. That'd be a useful step. So Vagrant is a way to run virtual machines on your computer. And a virtual machine is just a little computer running inside of your big computer, which I guess is a simplified way to explain it. So you can install something like VMware or VirtualBox, most commonly VirtualBox. And Vagrant is a tool, like kind of an easy wrapper around VMware or VirtualBox. And it will spin up a virtual machine. It will do things like set up file sharing and sharing the network and port forwarding if you configure it, and just all this stuff that makes it easy for you to just like run the command Vagrant up, have a server ready for you, and start developing. So it sets things up in a way that you can edit your local files in your editor that's on your computer and all that stuff. Changes to those files are reflected in the server and the little virtual machine that's running. And that way you have this isolation between your computer and all your development stuff. So you can just install whatever you need to on your virtual machine. You can totally mess up your virtual machine and destroy it and rebuild it, and that doesn't really affect your host computer at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm also a big fan of Vagrant, and that's one of the big reasons for it. You can treat it like a live server, and you can practice breaking things without actually causing real damage.
Yeah.
And you call it a sandbox in your book, and that's a great way to put it. So now the question is, do you ever have to go back to something like WAMP or XAMPP, or can you just stick to Vagrant?
So, I'm sure everything, the right answer to every question is it depends, which is really annoying, but it's the answer. So of course, yes, and a lot of people probably do successfully. I happen to be in a position where almost all the things I work on have kind of some externalities Like I might be using Postgre over MySQL, or I'll almost always try to make use of like Memcache or Redis. And I don't ever want to install that stuff on my host computer just because I don't want it running in the background. I don't want it taking up RAM. I don't want it breaking and leaving my host computer in some weird dirty state where there's like something half broken or some just files that don't belong to anything anymore. So I isolate all that in a virtual machine. I probably would use WAMP or something like that. I mean, I've just learned so much about server stuff that like that's not a convenience for me anymore. It's not saving me time. So I don't think I would, but that is not to say that other people should not. Yeah.
I honestly don't think I've gone back to WAMP since Vagrant. I'd love to know if someone disagrees with this. But anyway, once we have Vagrant installed and running, all it takes to get into your machine is to type Vagrant SSH and we're in. It's that simple. What steps would you first take as soon as you SSH into a new box? And let's assume we're talking about a live public server here.
Yeah, sure. So there's a whole bunch of security stuff to do in a production server. So once you get a new server on like DigitalOcean or Linode or AWS or something, there's all sorts of steps to take. Like, I think the first thing I typically do, so over time I've set up a bunch of Ansible roles to do this for me. And this is still kind of assuming I'm using Ubuntu because, what distribution you use changes stuff a little bit in this respect. Not really a ton. But let me look at a file here, and I can just go down the list of like the stuff that I do. So the first thing I'll usually do is set up users. So if you get a server from like Linode or DigitalOcean, you usually have a server that just has the root user enabled, and that root user will be logged in with a password. Typically, there are other cases where you use SSH keys. But either way, your root user can usually be logged into, or you can log into your server with a root user. So first thing I do is make like an admin user, and that user needs to use sudo to run any commands as root, any commands as a privileged user. So off the bat, that user so someone who logs in as that user, like maliciously, would need a password in order to do real damage to the computer because they need that user's password to run sudo. But then the next step to that is disabling the ability to log in as root, which is an SSH configuration. So, in addition to having a sudo user, you now also have stopped root from logging in over SSH. And then I create SSH keys for the user and any other users. There might be like a user specifically for deployment instead of an admin user and all that kind of stuff. And then since they have SSH keys, I disable the ability to log in with a password at all. So like you have these next levels of security. So the user has to have your private SSH key to log in, which is secure. Like it's pretty hard to steal someone's SSH key unless they publish it somewhere by accident. Their private key, that is. And then even if you log in, or actually I'll also typically put a password on that SSH key. So in order to log in, I need an SSH key. I need the password for the SSH key. If I log in and try to use a sudo command, I also need the password for that user. So like there's all these different levels you can kind of build up. So at the end of that, user has to have all those things in order to really do anything on the server, which is a lot more secure than what you get when you start, which is just root user with a password logging into this server.
Okay, I see. And
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, after that, there's other stuff like configuring the firewall. So
and that's the next step you covered in your book,
yeah.
And that's showing us how to set up firewall IP tables, which help add another layer of security.
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of rules do you recommend setting?
So I block everything except what you need to run the server. So typically, the only things open are like port 22 for SSH. 80 for HTTP traffic and 443 for HTTPS traffic. And then, expand out as you need to. So you might open up a port. So you might open up a port specifically on your private network if you have one, so that you can talk to like your MySQL server that's on a separate server within your private network. So, you can have like your public network, and there's multiple networks on a server typically. So if you spin up something like a DigitalOcean server and it has a private network also, then you can say like allow anything on the private network or only allow this other server, but on the private network only. And on the public network, the one we actually use to reach the server from, a public computer somewhere, block everything but port 80 and port 443. Or, you can mix and match rules like that as you need to.
Do you use Amazon Web Services for your hosting?
I mix it up. So DigitalOcean is like where my fideloper.com blog is. I'm using Linode for Service for Hackers. And I'll switch between DigitalOcean and AWS for my Service for Hackers videos because they're just really easy to spin up. And it depends on what I'm doing in the video, which one I decide.
Then is there any point in still doing this even if we're using Amazon Web Services and setting these rules through them, since they're already adding that layer of protection? Do you still go through the trouble of it?
I still do typically. I mean, that's habit and also just because I have these Ansible roles set up, so I just tell it to do it and it's just set up and done. But yeah, that is an extra layer because that doesn't set up IP tables. That's their own layer of security, like on top of what you can do inside your server.
Okay. And you also mentioned a tool called Fail to Ban. What is this tool and why do you recommend it?
I definitely recommend it. It's a tool that will monitor certain log files, and based on what it finds in your log files, it can perform actions. Those actions are typically like blocking a specific host using IP tables. So the one that's default and enabled when you first install fail to ban is the SSH one, and it monitors your auth log, and it checks for failed logins from specific IP addresses. So say some specific IP address has failed to log in 3, 4, 5 times, whatever you have configured in a row within a certain time period. It bans that user for half an hour permanently, whatever you configure. So you can do things like regex patterns against whatever log file and make your own kind of plugins for it and decide in what instances to ban like a host from adding. And that makes use of IP tables also, the firewall, to just block intrusion attempts.
And I saw we can also use Fail to Ban to protect Nginx. Are there any filters out there that you absolutely recommend?
Yeah, I don't use that so much. The ones I've seen are like protecting against basic auth attempts, and that's useful if you're using basic auth. But if you're not, then less useful. A lot of intrusion attempts. I mean, I'm not a security expert, so I don't know. Like I don't do a lot of stuff for Nginx. I'm pretty sure it's relatively secure. It doesn't do much dynamic stuff without you doing a lot of modification to it. So like someone doing an attack through like uploading a GIF that has PHP code embedded in it or something is a lot of stuff on the code side, not really an Nginx side.
Speaking of Nginx, we've covered basic security, so let's give our listeners a deeper understanding of how Nginx really works as a web server and why to use it over Apache. And you posted a quote in your book saying, Apache is like Microsoft Word. It has a million options, but you only need 6. Nginx does those 6 things, and it does 5 of them 50 times faster
Leah,
than
but I don't
Apache.
really know.
That's a quote by Chris Leah. Definitely gave me a good laugh. But it's true, and why? Why is it so performant compared to Apache?
Well, okay, so it's performant because it does stuff pretty differently. Apache, well, I guess Apache has a lot of features, and it's an older project, and I think its age has a lot to do with like the added features, and because of the added features, like how kind of complex the configuration can get. Nginx I like a lot better. Going directly to that quote, I like it better because the configuration is slimmer. There's less stuff going on. And in general, it just kind of like for me, the configuration just makes more sense kind of off the bat. Now, why it's more performant? So like Apache does things differently. So Apache and PHP has always been this weird pairing because it has this mod PHP stuff. And that embeds PHP in Apache, which isn't something you really see for many other languages. So like if you're using Apache for like a Ruby or Python application, that will fire off a request. It'll proxy a request off to something else that handles sending that code to the language. And that's actually what PHP-FPM does. So you can use Apache with PHP-FPM the same way you do with Nginx. And that offloads Apache from having to do that work. Having to do the work of like loading in PHP and parsing PHP if it's there and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's specific to PHP. But in general, Apache will create new processes and new threads to handle requests. And how it does that depends on your configuration because there's a few different ways to tell it to do that. But in general, you're getting multiple processes and optionally, if you enable them, multiple threads per process. And then you can tell it to do things like how many requests should be handled per process, if it should split multiple requests among different threads or not. And it's just all this kind of stuff where you end up with kind of like this expensive operation of creating and deleting and destroying lots of processes. And each process is, its own little copy of Apache that loads in the stuff it needs to and fulfills a request and all that stuff. So if a lot of stuff that people are saying is good to use now is away from that process and thread model and towards like a asynchronous event-based process where, or I should say application, that only runs very few processes. So you have one or two processes. Like typically in Nginx, you'll run as many processes as you have CPU cores, so that you only have a process per CPU core running. And each process is sort of like Node.js. It's asynchronous, it's evented. It'll just run process loop, and that loop will accept new requests and pause while it's waiting for like a network operation and accept a new request while it's waiting and do all this stuff. And like, send events to something else when something completes and that fires off. And that ends up being very efficient. You have like a lower memory usage. You don't have the overhead of creating, destroying, and tracking processes. Many processes, especially when your server gets busy. And it's generally more efficient because like that model typically steers you towards pushing off like more expensive or slower stuff to another process. An example of that is Nginx running any application, Python, Ruby, PHP, Java, whatever. If it finds a request that's not a static file, it will proxy that request off to wherever you tell it to. So PHP, the request goes to PHP-FPM. Python, it might go to like Unicorn or Green Unicorn or whichever one is the Python-based one, I forget. Circus D, whatever, all sorts of stuff. Ruby, the same story. It'll go off to, your Fusion Passenger or, I forget, Unicorn, whatever. I just forgot off the top of my head. So, in those situations, Nginx is not fulfilling that request. It's just shooting it off and then waiting for a response back. And while it's waiting, it'll do other stuff like handle the requests for some static assets and serve them and all that kind of stuff.
And Nginx uses sockets to communicate, right?
Yes. So it's typically, yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's always communicated through sockets. And there's like the file-based socket versus TCP-based socket, which is just different ways in Linux land to Unix land to send information to other stuff. And it will, you have to configure Nginx to say where that is. So if you are running a Python application and you get a request that's not a static file, you say, send anything that's not a static file to this proxy, and then that gets sent to whatever the backend is configured to. So that might be like something listening at localhost port 9000. So like Unicorn or Green Unicorn or PHP-FPM or whatever. The application gateway that kind of sits between your code and your server. And then the application gateway sends it to your code, gets a response, sends that back to to Nginx, and then that sends it back to your browser. And there's different protocols for that. So like PHP-FPM uses fast CGI. In Nginx might just send another HTTP request, or you might use Python's, UWSGI. There's all different protocols that Nginx can speak to connect to these application gateways.
And there are TCP sockets and Unix sockets, right? What's the difference between the two, and which one do you usually use personally?
So a Unix socket is a file, and I guess in Unix everything is sort of a file, and this is not really an exception. It's a faux file, and it's kind of like a placeholder. It appears as a file if you look for it on the file system, but it's like a mechanism to send data to to something, whatever it is, whatever that something is. So it behaves like a file though, so it can have permissions set and that kind of thing. So like if Nginx is reading to a file, it has to have permission to do that. So like Nginx running as user www data needs to have permission to like read and write to that Unix socket, which might also be owned by www data, but might be owned by something else. So those by just by means of what it is, can only be used locally. So Nginx can only speak to a Unix socket that is on the same system because it's a file, essentially. You can't talk to files in other servers. By a TCP socket is just a combination of an IP address and port. So that can be something listening on other servers remotely or something listening on the local host network. And that goes through the network interfaces rather than just the file system. So Unix sockets are typically a little faster, but I think that's pretty negligible compared to like a localhost TCP socket. TCP sockets have the overhead of sending a TCP request data, so it's like a little slower, and that's useful if you are distributing your application. So like if you have your PHP application, or I'm sorry, if you have PHP-FPM on 3 servers and Nginx is just sitting there in the middle of them distributing requests to them, you can do that with a TCP socket.
Would you use something like TCP sockets when load balancing and splitting up servers then?
Yeah, so I mean, there's load balancing where Nginx sends requests to other servers that also have Nginx, and then that Nginx proxies a request to PHP-FPM. And then there's like the load balancing where Nginx has a few different fast CGI places it can send requests to. So you could have multiple PHP-FPMs running on one server, and it just sends requests to different ones, or you can have those on remote servers also. So there's like different ways you can kind of distribute that.
Now we know how our web servers work, and we have a secure server. The next step I want to talk about is taking code on our local host and deploying it to our web server. Now, one big difference between Vagrant and a live server is that Vagrant uses file sharing, so as soon as you save a file, it refreshes it in your Vagrant box. On a live server, though, it doesn't work that way. But are there ways to mimic this? Like with rsync, for example, which you mentioned in your book?
Yep. There's stuff to do that, and I haven't used it. So, like, well, rsync won't watch files for changes, but you can like figure out a watcher that does watch for changes, and when it triggers, when it sees something change, it'll run an rsync command, which is something Vagrant will do for you. There's if you're running a remote server like a DigitalOcean provider, where it spins up a server on DigitalOcean instead of on your local computer, you can tell it to use rsync. And actually, in any situation, you can do this, but like the typical use case when there's a remote server, you can tell it to use rsync to sync up the files between your local computer and the server. But by default, it's kind of a manual process. But there's also a watcher, and that adds like a file watcher. So for any changes, it'll then kick off the rsync thing. And I mean, you can set up like NFS, like a network file share between your local and remote server, which would approximate that behavior. It would be slow still because you're pushing changes to a remote server constantly, essentially, because it's kind of monitoring for changes and that kind of thing.
Definitely not something we want to use for production then, because that would introduce a lot of bugs.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's definitely not something for a production usage. So like a production usage, you want to know what state everything is in when you deploy it to a server. So something where you manually or semi-manually or just whatever we have, or you push a release or something and that kicks off an automated process or whatever. But you don't want it just to be every change you make, of course.
So obviously there is a better way. This is not the way to do it, especially for larger sites. Can you walk us through the process that you would use personally to deploy to larger sites that perhaps require restarting services like Nginx web server or some kind of caching or something like that? Can you give us your process you go through?
Right. So, yep. So there's potentially a lot that can go into that, and of course, this is one of those things where what you do depends on your site also. So like I had a static service for hacker site where locally I was building a static site from one of those static site generators. And then when it was done, I would just use secure copy or rsync and just push the files up. So I had a script, a bash script that I made, and it was just like a one-line rsync command, and it just published the files from locally to the remote server. And in that case, it's static, so there's no services to reload. It's just new files are up in the server. Getting more complex, like the next level of complexity might be like a PHP application where you do typically just, quote unquote, with air quotes, just push new files. And it behaves a little bit kind of like a static site where those new files usually will just get sucked in and the changes are there. So depending on your situation, you might be able to get away with that, just being like a secure copy or rsync or something. A little more complex on top of that would be to use probably Git, where you have a deployment process that can either use Git and automate it, where Git will send a webhook to something listening, and that something listening knows there's a new version of code up there, and to pull that in on the server. So like your server might have a listener that pulls in new code from Git. Or you might have something like Envoy or Fabric or something, which is like an SSH task runner. So it essentially SSHs into your server and runs tasks. And those tasks could be like a deployment thing to get new files from Git and run any build process and swap out the old code for the new code and that kind of thing.
Have you ever tried using Capistrano by any chance?
I haven't. I've mimicked it with Envoy and Fabric, but I have not used actually Capistrano. I'm not a Ruby person at all. I've kind of intentionally have held off in learning it, not because I don't like it or anything, but because I have to like stay focused on some stuff, and adding Ruby into the mix would be too much right now.
That's the struggle as a developer. And I've spoken with PHP developers who use Capistrano and love it, even if they don't know any Ruby, because it's pretty simple to set up.
Yeah, definitely. And Ruby's on Ruby, like Python, it comes with almost everything. The servers you spin up on DigitalOcean or whatever, and then on your Mac and all this stuff. It's usually just there, so it's good to just grab and go.
You previously mentioned using the service called Ansible, and I've seen it around, but I'm not too sure what it does. Can you tell us how you use it and what it does?
So Ansible is a configuration management tool, which is essentially a way of saying what state you want on your servers, and then it will do the steps needed to take to get to that state. So the difference here is like if you use bash scripts, you're being declarative. You're not, what's the opposite of declarative? You're not being declarative, you're being imperative, I think is the right word. Where you're saying do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. That might not be idempotent, it might not have idempotence, whatever the right grammar for that is. Where if you rerun a script in bash, it might mess something up. Like if it has a find and replace operation on a file, or just whatever. If reinstalling something accidentally updates it instead of giving you the specific version you want. All sorts of stuff where that can mess up your server. So like in my Vapro Bash project, which is just Vagrant provisioning bash scripts, you can't provision a server twice by just rerunning the same bash scripts. Instead, you can use some configuration management tool, which is declarative, in which case you get to the opportunity to say, I want Nginx installed, I want this version. You do what you need to do to get to that state.
Okay. Then are you able to use Ansible as a monitoring tool, or is that not really what it's meant to do?
That's not really its use case. Like you could use it to install monitoring and set that up in an automated way. Like the beauty of it is that it's automation. It can be run automatically, and it will, for the most part, guarantee you the state that you want a server to be in. So a good example is that I have a set of Ansible roles, or a role is just like a orchestrated set of stuff. So like I have a role called Nginx. That role is responsible for installing Nginx, but also, in addition to just saying apt-get install Nginx, it will create the directories that need to be created. It will set up the virtual host configuration I need, and any other configuration. It just guarantees me that it's going to be in the right state. So this reproducibility is powerful for when problems happen, because you can spin up a new server, you just run your Ansible stuff, and it's all exactly as you need it. And it has this really nice like dev test cycle because it's idempotent. Because it'll when you rerun it, you'll get the stuff that's correct will be in the same state still. So like when I'm making a role, I'll just keep rerunning it over and over again. Something broke, I'll tweak it, I'll rerun it over and over again. I don't have to do anything crazy. Like it doesn't work. It doesn't break because I just ran it a second ago and like rerunning it breaks something. So an example of that is when I first set up the Service for Hacker site, this latest iteration of it. I was playing around with some sudoer stuff, which is just like who can use bash and how. Or I'm sorry, who can use the sudo command and how. And I broke it, which means no one could use sudo, which means I was just locked out of everything. And before I could contact the host, like one way to fix that is to contact the hosting, figure out how to get into the console so you're logged in directly and not over an SSH connection, because that way you can log in as root and do stuff. It was quicker for me to spin up a new server, run my Ansible task. In 5 minutes, my server is up and running. I changed DNS over and it's fixed. It's really nice for that kind of thing. And you can get pretty complicated with it. It will know information about all the servers you're pushing to. So you can you could set up like a load balancer and it kind of knows the addresses of all the other servers to point to. And you can make a configuration out of that. So it kind of is it can be used for deployment, and also deployment in a way that where you build a new server when you deploy code instead of just update code on an existing server.
Have you ever used it to deploy code?
I don't use it to deploy. No, I haven't used it like that.
Can you show us your Ansible configuration files, or do they contain sensitive information?
I can show you, because all the sensitive information is encrypted. So Ansible can encrypt it also. Most like Chef and Puppet, they have all different mechanisms to encrypt sensitive information.
Have you ever used Chef?
I've played with Chef, and it was a few years ago. It was before I was kind of ready to know what it was and learn it. So then I found Ansible. I did a talk in Ansible recently where I kind of go into why I chose Ansible, but the basic of it is that you sort of have this one-to-one mapping to bash scripts. So like Ansible is a great thing to graduate to when you're comfortable with bash scripting and setting up servers with doing all that kind of work manually.
You mentioning bash scripts just reminded me, I forgot to ask you a question earlier about Vagrant, where do you usually install Vagrant and configure it manually, or do you use something in front of it like Puffbit or Protobox or something like that?
I have my own right now. Because I created that Vapor Bash project with Vagrant specifically, I've usually used that, and that is just bash scripts. In recent stuff, I've made my own set of Ansible roles. And I did my own because there was some stuff I wanted to play with that's a little more custom than those sites want, or can do, which makes sense. They're for the general use case. I have used them. They're great. They really kind of like just work, which is what you want out of something like that.
Yeah, they're great to just get you up and running really quickly.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm probably always going to use Ansible to do my development box. So for the Service for Hacker site, I have all these Ansible roles. And they're exactly what I run in production, except now they're also running my local server. So I have the exact same server locally as in production, so I don't get surprises, and it's been great. That's saved me a few times because I've done some funky stuff, like just to play around with it and learn about it. I run PHP-FPM in cherooted, or however you pronounce that. That's another one of those words I don't know how to pronounce, but I cheroot PHP-FPM. And that means everything is relative to whatever directory you cheroot it to. Like that, it's its own little world. All PHP knows about is this one directory that you've given it, and that has some nasty side effects. Like PHP doesn't know how to use curl because the libraries, like the C level libraries for curl are missing. It doesn't know where they are. It can't resolve DNS if you connect it, because like the stuff to resolve DNS is not there. So you end up doing this crazy stuff. So it has access to that. And none of that is in like a Puppet or Puffbit or whatever. So bad. I don't know.
Yeah, with all these names, like when you said cheroot, it took me a second to figure out what you were talking about.
I've heard someone else say it, which means it's legit.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. I have no idea. Okay, so should I share my screen here?
Yeah, go for it.
Share screen. Let's share the entire screen here. All right, can you see that? Nope, I don't want to go full screen. All right, I'm not going to do full screen, but it will make it bigger. Anything specific? There's a bunch. So you can see all these roles here I have, right? So first of all, I have a playbook. So do you want to see Ansible things, or is this more generic?
Yeah, just show us what you think would be beneficial to us.
So I have...
Oh, I see. It's a YAML file.
Exactly, yeah. Ansible uses YAML for almost everything. So I have this one called Ansible that I use to provision my Ansible stuff locally, and it uses the same roles as I do for my production site, except for SSH, because I don't want it to... so Vagrant has the configuration, the standard thing where it creates a user Vagrant, and that user Vagrant can use sudo without needing a password and all that stuff. And my configuration would change all that, so I don't make new users and turn off root access and all that kind of stuff. But I do all the other stuff, which like installs basic server stuff, sets up the firewall, fail demand, all that kind of stuff, adds my SSL certificates, all that stuff is done there. And on top of it, I've added extra tasks to install Node.js so I can use grunt and that kind of thing. But you can see, like, I can just define what hosts to use, what user to log in as, to use sudo. You can define some variables here. There's all sorts of stuff. But, the basics is not the meta, but the tasks here. Can you read this? Should I make this bigger?
Yeah, I can see it. That's pretty good.
Just because. So like my server, first thing that gets run on the server is to install these packages, start NTP, which is like a thing that syncs up the system clock with some remote servers so that they're always in sync. And then I turn on this periodic configuration unattended upgrades is like an automated security upgrade, so it will update security packages in the background automatically.
For that list of with items where you have ACL, curl, vim, and all that, is that executed and installed in that specific order? Probably doesn't matter in this situation. I'm just curious.
So that's a good question. I think it'll be in this order, but because Ansible is based on Python, that depends on how the object type it creates works, which I think is a list. It's probably a list, but I don't know for sure. Like a Python list, which I don't know if that goes in the order it's created or not. If I was a good programmer, I would know, but I'm just
no worries.
So there's the server stuff, and then what else? Then there's the firewall, and the firewall just has settings. This is all IP table stuff. So like you can see here, this is a dump of IP table stuff using the IP tables save command, which you can use to save the IP table state and then restore it and that kind of thing. So I just pop this file in the server and tell it to restore from this file.
This actually looks a lot more straightforward than I thought it would be.
Oh, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. So like you just say anything in the loopback interface. This is the localhost network should be allowed through. This one's complicated to explain, but anything that's established currently should be allowed through. So like if I didn't have this rule and I blocked SSH, then I would just be cut off because I just stopped SSH from working. But because I said to use currently established connections, to allow them, yeah, it won't block them off. But then it allows port 22, which is SSH, and then port 80, 443. And
would you ever recommend switching from port 22 for SSH for security reasons?
I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background. Oh, do you hear that? God, this microphone picks up everything, which is... Let me get the dog real quick. Sorry, a second. All right, sorry about that. So yeah, I do use port 22. I've read that stuff can figure out what port you're using anyway. So it ends up not being. Yeah, it is, and it's. I mean, of course, there's different opinions on it, right? So that's a security through obscurity kind of thing, and a lot of people don't believe in that. Some people do. I have used other ports in the past, but you run into like just the human error issue where someone doesn't know what port it is, and that leads to confusion. So I just keep it in port 22, and I just use all the other security stuff around it, like fail to ban and SSH keys and the usual stuff.
And I see you have Beanstalk D in that list of folders. What do you use Beanstalk D for?
I did. I've actually recently used Amazon SQS, which is basically just a replacement for it. Because Beanstalk D is a thing that will remember the jobs in the queue and then give them to whatever the next thing asks for a new job. So rather than actually have another thing in my server, I've just simplified it and cost myself like 5 cents a month using SQS, Amazon SQS. So I've eliminated a headache of something that can break on my infrastructure, and I've cost myself, for 5 cents or whatever.
What kind of use cases do you use a queuing system for?
So on the Service for Hacker site right now, that's just sending emails and probably some Slack notifications for like when someone signs up or something. Vanity metrics.
I know it's also pretty useful to queue email signups.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like if I do any image processing, it'll be done with that kind of thing.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing some of these configuration files with us. And let's move on and talk about monitoring our servers and apps. What do you use and recommend for monitoring?
I mean, so I don't use, and I've only lately played with like kind of, I was about to say custom, but not really custom, but like the usual open source monitoring stuff. So like Nagios and just all sorts of stuff. But on my, I have used New Relic. I might even be able to log into that and see, but I think I only have that on my old, one of my old servers. 1 second. So like Linode has Longview, and you just install something and it will monitor like your current CPU usage and memory and all that kind of stuff. Similarly, New Relic. Let's see if I even remember. I haven't checked this in forever. It's still running on an old server on the free tier. It's not even my 1Password, so I don't know.
Yeah, New Relic offers really nice services. The APM version, for example, lets you monitor your applications, and the server version monitors resource usage. And I wrote a blog post about setting it up. It's actually super easy. It doesn't take long at all. Very easy setup.
Yeah, and that's actually has... Oh, good. I figured it out. That one has saved me before. Like, I remember we had a site on... it was just a client in my old job in a marketing place. They had New Relic on their servers, and there was like a zombie process that kept getting created and killed, and that was slowly eating up memory. So I caught that like days before that crashed the server. So like that alone was worth it. But yeah, exactly. I haven't even logged into this in a while. But New Relic shows a lot of stuff. Like this is even the free tier is good for seeing like what. Not the free tier, I guess, but the one above it is great for seeing like what SQL queries are expensive and how much time they're taking and all that kind of stuff. So if you integrate that with your application, it's great. But then of course there's the actual server stuff where we can set up notifications for, how much CPU is getting used, how much RAM, and how much hard drive space you have left, and all that kind of stuff. And then I think they still probably charge by as you go up in the tiers, you get more historical data. How long it'll save your. So like you can see, it says 13 PHP-FPM processes running because some people are on the site. I have a Python app running on it, I guess, apparently. I think I remember what that is.
That's a perfect example of why this is useful.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know what that is, but it's there. And so Nagios I've played with, but I haven't had an infrastructure that required like its own infrastructure for monitoring other stuff. But Nagios is kind of like the old standard for monitoring processes and seeing what's on the computer, setting up alerting, setting thresholds and getting graphs.
Is this a web client or is it software you download and install on your computer?
It is a web client. You do have to install it. It's more than a web client. You have to install stuff, and then on every server you're monitoring, you have like one tool that gets system metrics, and then other tools that are specific to like for your application, or making sure HTTP things are listening to each other. And there's a lot of stuff. There's like a um,
I know Amazon Web Services has the CloudWatch as well. You have to pay for
yeah,
that one.
yeah. In fact, I haven't. Yeah, they charge everything's probably hourly. I forget. There's like an alternative New Relic also that's free, but I forget server density. There's like an open source version of New Relic, and it's decent. And then there's Facebook's query something. Pingdom. Wish I could find this. Whatever. I have it in my notes somewhere. But like, there's one that Facebook makes where you can query it kind of like a SQL query, and you can even make new tables, and each that relates to stuff running on your server. And then you can just query that and get system information, and that's kind of nice. So you can build like a wrapper around that to get system info. And I guess I'll try to send you some links so you can link them out. There's really a bunch of really nice ones.
Fantastic. I'll keep an eye out for other monitoring tools, and if you're wondering where to start, I recommend checking out my blog post about monitoring tools, which I'll link to. For now, it talks about New Relic. Hopefully I can add some other free ones and paid ones in the future. Chris, how can people get in touch with you if they have any comments, questions, or if they just want to reach out to you?
Yeah, easiest is probably Twitter or email. So Twitter, I'm at Fideloper, and my email is just fideloper@gmail.com.
Don't forget to check out his book, Servers for Hackers, and website, serversforhackers.com. Chris, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you all for watching and being a part of it.